Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us here today in Yellowstone National Park. I'm Ranger Allison, and we are filming today in front of the Roosevelt Arch, which is in the northwest corner of the park. It is a beautiful spring day, hinting at summer weather. The sun is shining, there are fluffy white clouds, and the sky is a beautiful bright blue. We can see snow on the tops of the mountain ranges around us. We can hear the birds singing. There's grass growing, and there's even water flowing here today in the park. All of these things work together to make a functioning ecosystem and environment for us here in Yellowstone. And in life, things are interacting and making their own ecosystems and environments all over the planet. There are things that just make sense together. So myself and Ranger Margot have worked to bring you a program today on how things interact. And there are things that kind of don't make sense, like Ranger Margot, what doesn't go with oil?
Water.
What about orange juice?
Toothpaste.
Ugh. But there are things that do just work, like peanut butter,
Jelly.
salt,
Pepper.
macaroni.
Cheese.
Margot.
Allison.
Yay! So there are things that make sense here in our environment, and those relationships that are between living things and non-living things is what we're going to talk about today. So when we have a relationship between two close species where one benefits and the other one we'll talk about later, that's called symbiosis, or a symbiotic relationship. So at least one species benefits in a symbiotic relationship, and the other species can either be negatively impacted, neutrally impacted, or positively impacted. When we have a species that is negatively impacted, we consider that parasitic. So that means that there is one organism living off of another organism. So the one parasite is benefiting, but the host is not. So to give you a better idea, we are going to come up with an example for you. So take these two colors. On their own, totally fine. But when we mix them together, it's not an ideal relationship for both parties involved. So that's parasitic. When that second species is neither positively nor negatively impacted, that species, or that relationship, is called commensalism. And that can be represented by these two colors. On their own, they're totally fine. But when we mix them together, that doesn't create an ideal relationship for both parties. When that second species in our symbiotic relationship is positively impacted, we have a mutualistic relationship, or mutualism. So let's take these two colors and mix them together. And you can see that there is a third color that's created. It's an ideal pair for both of those species. The result is beneficial for both. And out of those three symbiotic relationships, mutualism is the closest to friendship that we can get in nature. So it is only fitting that I introduce one of my all-time best friends and co-rangers, Ranger Margot.
Hey, thanks, Ranger Allison. How fitting to have best friends working together to bring you a program about mutualism, or friendships, in nature. And we can see mutualism happening all around the globe. In fact, we are examples of that right now. We are sharing with you a place that's incredibly special to us, and you're tuning in from all across the world. So today we're going to be talking about mutualism specifically here in Yellowstone National Park. And with me, in order to explain that, I have examples of different ecosystems in Yellowstone. So we'll be using paint to visually represent the mutualistic relationships between some of our species in these different parts of the ecosystem and how it brings them together to create this functioning ecosystem. So from the tiniest ticks to the largest predators, we're gonna dive in and start exploring Yellowstone National Park. Now, one of our most popular ecosystems is our thermal basins. And we can see an amazing example of mutualism right in that hot soil. Now, while most plants can't survive in a hot soil environment, some can. In this photo, we see an example of a thermal basin. We can see a hot spring and we can see trees in the background. If you look around the hot spring, you might notice some white rock with very little vegetation around it. But some plants, like panic grass or Diconthelium lanuginosum, can survive in these hot soils, partially due to a type of fungus that lives on its roots that acts almost like a type of armor. And this fungus is called Curvularia protuberate. So this fungus is believed to provide the grass with water, nutrients, and something that helps it tolerate that heat. And the fungus gets back sugars, water, and a home from the plant's roots in return. So how can we represent this? Well, we can take a couple of colors and show that if we have our panic grass near our thermal features and our fungi living on its roots, and we mix those together, we're going to get green. From this blue of our panic grass, the yellow of the fungi and its roots, we can see that mutualistic relationship represented in that color green. Now, you might be able to see fungi interacting in ecosystems right near your home. A very popular example of fungi interacting mutually with algae is when they create lichen. Now, lichen can be found on rocks, trees, even your own buildings. So keep an eye out for those mutualistic relationships, both here in Yellowstone and near your own home. So as we move throughout Yellowstone, another example that you might see in your own backyard as well and across the world is that of pollinators. Pollinators are a great example of a mutualistic relationship. So in this photo, we can see that there is a bee and a butterfly both on the same flower. And so these pollinators collect pollen and nectar to nourish themselves. As they do this, they're cross-pollinating by bringing extra pollen from one plant to the next, helping the plants to reproduce or propagate. Now, it's springtime in Yellowstone here, so we're going to have a lot of these examples of wildflowers popping up in our fields throughout Yellowstone. So how can we represent that on our poster? Well, if we have our nice red flowers and our bumbling bees, when those are combined, suddenly we can see a mutualistic representation of the color orange. So again, these fields are created throughout all of Yellowstone, and we can see these relationships happening. Now, as I said, pollinators can be seen across a lot of the globe. And they're just one example of these types of pollen or even seeds being distributed. In fact, we might be able to see over 270 different species of birds in Yellowstone, but some of them interact a little bit more mutually than others do. For instance, a blackbird, a magpie, or a brown-headed cowbird, like you can see in the photo that I'm holding up, may be seen on top of species like elk or bison that you can see it standing on its fur in this photo. So these birds are getting a nice, easy meal out of the bugs in that bison's fur. Meanwhile, the bison is getting free winter tick removal from its fur by this bird. So this is a great example of mutualistic relationships that you might be able to see when you come here and see our largest ungulate and some of our common birds. But how can we represent that in our ecosystem? Pretty easily, if we represent them with colors. So we may have some red of our bison or blue of our black-headed cowbird, but when we combine them, we see a nice purple color starting to be created, again, representing that mutualistic relationship. Man, these are absolutely everywhere. And birds, like I said, we have a lot of different species of birds. They aren't just mutualistic with our animals like bison and elk, they're also mutualistic with some plants. In fact, over 100 different species benefit from the relationship between bird and plant as they help to disperse seeds. But even some seeds and berries are a little bit too big for birds to disperse. So we have a different example of that kind of disperser here in Yellowstone. We see a mutualistic relationship in this photo between a black bear and a white bark pine. So in this photo, we can see that this bear has a pine cone in its mouth and seeds and bits of tree all across its fur. Now, bears have large home ranges, so they make excellent seed dispersers and transporters. And those larger seeds are much more easily dispersed by them than some birds may be. So again, we can see this relationship happening throughout parts of our ecosystem, as black bears are fairly common in Yellowstone. So let's see how that paint may help represent it. So if we take a bit of yellow to represent our seeds and a bit of blue to represent our bear, when we combine those, once again, we get that nice green coloration. And so we're going to see some of that throughout our different ecosystem here. Now, bears are omnivores, so they are going to hunt for things like seeds and berries and plants, but they're also going to hunt for things like meat. When we think of predators, we may think of animals like our wolves, hunting in packs. Now, in this photo, we don't just see a wolf, we also see ravens and magpies, because, believe it or not, these birds and the wolves have been seen having a mutualistic relationship. How does that work? Well, the birds may have an easier time spotting a carcass than the wolves do. So the birds may make a lot of noise, attracting the wolves to that carcass, making it an easier time for them to find it and a quicker time for them to find it. The birds, in return, get an easier meal because they may not be strong enough to open up that carcass, but the wolves will do it for them and they will feast on those scraps. Birds don't mind having scraps. In fact, ravens will also often follow wolves back to their dens, hoping that the food they bring their pups will be dropped outside and they can pick up some of the scraps. They will even scavenge in the scat or poop of our wolves in order to get some of the scraps of meat that may be left behind. And as they carry it away, they're doing those wolves a favor by cleaning up their habitat. So for our last example, let's see how these two work together. A little bit of red for our wolf, some yellow for our birds, and when they're combined, once again, we're seeing that nice orange color. So we can see these colors, these relationships, all throughout our ecosystems. Now, as all of these relationships that we've seen work together in pairs to create these good colors or these mutualistic relationships, they also work together to create this functioning ecosystem. And while we just covered a number of mutualistic relationships in nature, there are also a number of other types of mutualistic relationships that you may find in the park. Because it takes hundreds of people and a number of different organizations for Yellowstone to truly run successfully. Now, even early expeditions knew this because they brought people of various skills to explore. They had explorers and leaders, they had navigators, researchers, artists, and so much more. And while people knew that this place was special, we needed a combination of facts, experiences, and images in order to convince Congress to set this land aside as the world's first national park, as public land back in 1872. We still need this combination of facts, experiences, and images. We still need a combination of partnerships to help run Yellowstone today. And I bet, Ranger Allison, do you happen to have some input on those mutualistic relationships today?
I do. Yeah. Thanks, Ranger Margot. I love your artwork. I think you were alluding to, I have had the great pleasure of working for one of our partners. So I currently work for Yellowstone National Park, and I have put in some time with Yellowstone Forever, which is the park's nonprofit partner. And that's just one example of a mutualistic relationship on a bigger picture. Yellowstone National Park needs our nonprofit partners. We need our concessions, our university partners like University of Montana. We partner with USGS, which is the United States Geological Survey, and there's the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory. We also partner with volunteers who dedicate their time to collect data, to educate others, to study our ecology and geology. And you know what? We even have a mutualistic relationship with all of you. You share your photos, your stories, your experiences with each other, and you get each other excited, not only about Yellowstone National Park, but about all of our shared lands. So Margot and I are really excited to have shared some of those mutualistic relationships with you from Yellowstone, and we would love to hear what friendships are in your communities. Share with someone some photos, some experiences, some stories, maybe even your own version of the artwork we created today. Because to protect, to preserve, to benefit from our public lands, it takes mutualistic relationships, partnerships, and even friendships. Thank you for joining us today here in Yellowstone National Park. Share this video with your friends, get outside, and we'll see you next time.